Walter Harris, a kind-hearted veteran janitor, secretly feeds Jaden, a hungry student, sparking a quiet ritual of compassion at Jefferson Elementary. His discreet lunches left on a bench brighten Jaden's days until Principal Landers catches them, firing Walter for breaking rules. As Walter leaves, Jaden, devastated, writes to his uncle, Captain Becker. Unbeknownst to the school, Jaden's late father was a heroic Marine, and Walter's past intertwines with his sacrifice. A military convoy is now approaching, ready to honor Walter's silent heroism. What will happen when their mission unfolds, and will justice prevail for Walter's kindness? Love stories where compassion triumphs? Subscribe to our channel. Join our community to uncover tales of unsung heroes like Walter, whose kindness changed lives. Hit that subscribe button, share your thoughts, and help us spread stories that inspire. Together, let's celebrate the power of doing what's right. The Lunchbox Legacy. Walter Harris, a 67-year-old retired Marine, lived a life of quiet purpose in the sleepy suburbs of Florida. After decades in logistics during the Iraq War, he had returned to a world that felt both familiar and foreign, settling into a small apartment 3 blocks from Jefferson Elementary School. His home was a humble sanctuary, its walls lined with faded photographs of desert horizons and fellow soldiers, their smiles frozen in time. A few military medals, polished but unassuming, rested in a drawer, their weight a reminder of sacrifices made. Each morning, Walter walked to the school where he worked as a janitor, his pace deliberate, as if each step was a meditation on a life well lived. Rain or shine, he arrived with a gentle smile, ready to sweep the halls and mend the small chaos of childhood. To the students of Jefferson, Walter was more than a janitor. He was Mr. Walter, a storyteller whose tales of distant lands captivated their young minds. His custodian's cart, dubbed the treasure trolley, held a secret, a hidden compartment stuffed with peppermints and butterscotch candies, reserved for children whose eyes carried the weight of a bad day. A kindergartner missing home, a 4th grader stung by a math test's red marks. Walter saw them all, his heart attuned to their quiet struggles. Mr. Walter makes the floors shine, but he makes sad faces shine brighter. A 2nd grader had written in a class essay, her words a testament to the light he brought to their world. He carried their trust like a badge of honor. Each candy slipped into a small hand, a silent promise to care. In early September, Walter's keen eyes spotted a boy named Jaden, a 10-year-old who lingered alone after lunch. While other children raced across the playground, their laughter fueled by full bellies, Jaden sat on a stone bench, clutching only a water bottle. His shoulders slumped, his gaze fixed on the ground, as if willing it to swallow his hunger. Walter approached with the care of a man who'd seen too much suffering to ignore it. "Everything okay, son?" he asked softly. Jaden's eyes flickered away, his voice a faint murmur. "My mom was busy today. She probably forgot to pack something." Walter recognized the boy's pride, a fragile armor against an ache he knew too well. He'd seen that look in war-torn places, on faces young and old, where hunger was a silent enemy. Without pressing, Walter nodded and returned to his broom, but his heart was already weaving a plan. The next morning, Walter packed an extra lunch, a turkey and cheese sandwich, an apple, and a carton of milk. Simple but hearty. During the lunch period, he left half his own meal on the bench near the trash cans, where Jaden often sat. It was a quiet gesture, unnoticed by the bustling playground. Each day, Walter repeated the ritual, slipping away before Jaden arrived. The boy never spoke of the lunches, but Walter saw the change. Jaden's eyes sparkled with new light. His steps carried a bounce, and his laughter began to weave into the playground's joyful chorus. For 3 weeks, this silent pact flourished. Walter poured care into each meal, adding handwritten notes to ignite the boy's curiosity. "Did you know the desert sand can sing?" one note read. "When the wind moves just right, the grains hum a melody only the patient hear." Another shared, "In Iraq, I saw a star so bright, it felt like hope was shining just for us." Each note was a thread, tying Jaden's heart to a world beyond his struggles. But on a crisp Friday in late September, the delicate routine crumbled. Principal Margaret Landers, a woman whose efficiency was as sharp as her clipboard, stepped onto the playground just as Jaden opened the lunchbox. Her eyes flashed with outrage, her voice cutting through the air. "Who gave you that?" Who authorized anyone to distribute food to students? The playground froze, the hum of recess silenced as children and teachers turned to watch. Walter, emptying a trash bin nearby, felt a knot tighten in his chest. He stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. I did, ma'am. I just didn't want the boy to go hungry. Lander's face reddened, her words a storm. School is not a charity. Who gave you permission to feed him? This breaks every rule. Health codes, policies, liability. What if he had allergies? What if his parents sued? Walter stood still, his hands gripping the unopened lunchbox, his head bowed not in guilt, but in quiet acceptance. Two security guards, called by a teacher's frantic phone call, approached, their presence a jarring contrast to the man who'd spent years fixing broken toys and mopping up spills. The students watched, their young hearts grappling with the confusion. A third grader, clutching a jump rope, whispered, "But he was just being nice." A teacher's sharp glance hushed her, but the words hung heavy, a truth too pure for the moment. That afternoon, Walter received termination papers, the sterile phrases, food safety violations, unauthorized student interaction, insubordination, turning his compassion into a crime. As he packed his locker, folding a spare uniform and tucking away a tin of candies, he didn't plead or protest. He met Lander's gaze with steady eyes. I understand, ma'am, but I'd do it again. Lander's unmoved crossed her arms. This is inappropriate. We have proper channels. You can't just feed children and without permission. 3 days later, the school's parking lot stirred with an unexpected sight. Rows of Marines in crisp uniforms, their faces etched with pride and solemnity. Whispers spread through the halls as students pressed against windows, their curiosity alight. Who were they here for, and why would an entire platoon salute a fired janitor? Walter's quiet act of kindness, born from a simple lunchbox, had sparked a chain of events that would reveal the depth of his heart and the reach of his legacy. Under the harsh glare of the afternoon sun, Walter Harris stepped through the school's front gates, his silver hair catching the light like a quiet beacon. His shoulders, squared with the unyielding posture of a soldier, carried the weight of 8 years spent tending to the children of this small Florida school. Now, those years had ended with a single word: termination. The principal's voice still echoed in his mind, sharp and unyielding, citing unauthorized actions as the reason for his dismissal. Walter's only crime had been slipping a tray of food to a hungry boy, a small act of kindness that had cost him everything. He didn't turn back to look at the building that had been his second home. His heart ached, not with anger, but with a deep, familiar sorrow, the kind that comes from doing what's right and paying the price. Unbeknownst to him, a pair of young eyes followed his every step from behind a classroom window, wide with disbelief and brimming with tears. Those eyes belonged to Jaden Becker, a boy whose quiet resolve would soon ripple through their tight-knit community. Jaden hadn't shown up to school for 3 days after Walter's firing. His absence left an empty space in the classroom, his usual bench by the window standing as a silent testament to the injustice that had unfolded. His homeroom teacher, Mrs. Carter, brushed off questions from curious classmates with a vague mention of sick leave, her tone clipped, offering no room for further inquiry. But Jaden wasn't sick, not in body at least. At home, in the modest apartment he shared with his mother, he sat alone at the kitchen table, surrounded by walls adorned with faded military photographs and glinting medals. His mother, Lisa Becker, worked grueling night shifts at the hospital, her days spent sleeping to recover from the endless cycle of labor. The fridge held just enough food for the week, every item carefully chosen, every dollar stretched to its breaking point. Jaden's thoughts churned as he stared at the lined paper before him, a pencil gripped tightly in his small hand. He was writing to his uncle, Captain Ronald Becker, a Marine stationed in North Carolina. Each word was deliberate, etched with the care of someone far older than his years, though the occasional misspelling betrayed his youth. His heart pounded with a mix of fear and determination as he poured his truth onto the page. Uncle Ron, I'm okay, but something bad happened, Mr. Walter, the only person who's been kind to me, got fired for giving me food. The principal was so loud, it scared me. I think Dad would be sad if he knew. Jaden folded the letter with precision, the corners aligned perfectly, a habit his father had taught him before his final deployment. He used his meager allowance to buy a stamp, walking alone to the mailbox under the weight of his thoughts. The letter arrived in North Carolina 2 days later, landing on Captain Becker's desk amid a pile of military paperwork. Ronald's face remained stoic as he read his nephew's words, but his chest tightened with a quiet fury. Without a word, he handed the letter to his commanding officer, Colonel James Hargrove, a man whose stern features bore the marks of 30 years in service. "Sir, this concerns my brother's son," Ronald said, his voice steady but laced with urgency. The colonel read the letter twice, his eyes narrowing as the gravity of the situation settled over him. He understood immediately, though no one at the school, not even Walter, knew the full weight of what had transpired. Jaden's father, Staff Sergeant Michael Becker, had been killed in action 3 years earlier. His transport had been obliterated by an IED in a combat zone. But despite catastrophic injuries, Michael had dragged 3 Iraqi children to safety before succumbing to his wounds. For his sacrifice, he'd been awarded the Silver Star posthumously. The medal lay tucked in Jaden's bedroom drawer, too painful for Lisa to display, yet too sacred to store away. Since Michael's death, Lisa had poured herself into 2 jobs: hospital receptionist by night, delivery driver by day, her pride keeping her from applying for the free lunch program. That same pride had silenced Jaden about his hunger, even when his stomach growled during class. "My dad was a hero," he'd once told a classmate who noticed his empty lunch tray, his voice firm with conviction. Heroes don't complain. The morning after Colonel Hargrove read Jaden's letter, he summoned an entire unit for a mission, unlike any they'd undertaken before. "This isn't about combat," he told them, his voice resonant with purpose. "It's about protecting honor." The briefing was brief but clear. Recognize a civilian who had lived the Marine Corps' values without ever knowing the depth of his impact. The unit set out in 3 dust-covered black SUVs, crossing state lines with gift boxes, a neatly folded triangular flag, and a framed uniform in tow. Word of their mission spread through military channels, and by the time they reached the Georgia-Florida line, their convoy had swelled with veterans from 3 bases, all converging on Jaden's small elementary school. During the drive, Captain Becker shared the full story with his men. The man who was fired, Walter Harris, served in the 7th Logistics Battalion in Iraq, he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He wasn't just any veteran. He was one of the men who ensured my brother's body came home with dignity." He passed around a photograph of a younger Walter, standing solemnly beside a flag-draped transfer case. "And now he's lost his job for feeding my brother's son." The news sent a wave of quiet anger through the convoy. A sergeant in the back seat removed his cap, his calloused fingers tracing its edge as he processed the injustice. "Sir," he asked, his voice low, "does the school know who they fired?" Ronald shook his head. "No," he replied, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "But they're about to find out." The highway stretched endlessly before the convoy, a shimmering ribbon of asphalt under the blazing sun. Walter Harris, a man whose quiet strength spoke louder than words, gazed out the window, his thoughts adrift. He never spoke of his service, not to the children who adored his stories at Jefferson Elementary, nor to the neighbors who saw only an unassuming janitor. The memories of his duty, handling fallen soldiers with a reverence that felt almost holy, were buried deep, too sacred for casual recounting. Nights spent pressing uniforms, polishing buttons until they gleamed, ensuring every family received their loved one with dignity, had shaped him in ways he could never articulate. Yet, as the miles blurred by, Walter's heart wasn't heavy with his own burdens, but with worry for Jaden, the boy whose hungry eyes had sparked this journey. In the trailing vehicle, a younger Marine broke the quiet. "My cousin's kid goes to that school," he said, his voice tinged with admiration. "Walter's always spinning tales about desert sand in his boots, making the kids laugh. Never mentions the hard stuff, though. Never talks about the ones he brought home." The words lingered, heavy with respect. The silence that followed was rich with understanding, a bond only those who'd served could fully grasp. For veterans, honoring the fallen was the highest calling, and failing that duty was unthinkable. Each person in the convoy felt it, a fire in their chest, a need to right a wrong. As they crossed into Florida, Captain Ronald Becker's phone buzzed. He answered, his jaw tightening as he absorbed the news. What began as one unit's response had grown into a movement. Veteran networks buzzed. Social media channels lit up with military families sharing the story, the invisible brotherhood of service uniting across state lines. By morning, Marines from 3 bases would descend on Jefferson Elementary, a small school now the epicenter of something profound. It's not just about the boy anymore, Becker's commanding officer said, his voice resolute. It's about what Harris stands for. Dignity doesn't end with discharge papers. It's forever. Becker's resolve deepened, his grip on the phone tightening. This was about principle, about a legacy that refused to fade. In his small apartment, Walter sat alone, a shoebox of photographs open before him. His fingers trembled as he lifted a faded image of himself in desert fatigues beside a transport plane. His younger self stared back, eyes steady but carrying a nascent weight. Another photo captured a moment of solemnity, his gloved hands adjusting a flag over a fallen soldier, the fabric taut and flawless. His chest ached, pride and loss intertwined. He wasn't angry about losing his job. That pain was fleeting compared to his fear for Jaden. The boy's hollow gaze haunted him, a reminder of a vow to never let a child go hungry. His eyes drifted to a photo of a unit gathering, a young sergeant barely visible in the background. Jaden's father, though Walter hadn't made the connection. The link was there, a quiet thread binding past to present. With a heavy heart, Walter dialed a community service number. "Hello," he said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "I'd like to report a child who might need food assistance." He spoke with care, unaware that a convoy of Marines was speeding toward Jefferson Elementary with a far greater mission. His concern for Jaden burned brightly, a flicker of hope that someone would step in. Monday morning, 6:57 a.m., Jefferson Elementary's parking lot crackled with anticipation. 3 military SUVs rolled in, followed by a procession of personal vehicles, their tires crunching against the asphalt. Marines in dress uniforms stepped out, their polished buttons glinting in the dawn light, transforming the modest school into a stage for something extraordinary. Parents froze, car doors half open as the formation took shape. Children clutched backpacks, eyes wide with wonder. "What on earth?" muttered the gym teacher, his coffee cup forgotten, steam curling into the air. The Marines moved with precision, boots striking in unison. One held a sign, "We are here for Walter Harris, veteran, 67 years old." The words sent whispers rippling through the crowd. Principal Landers arrived, her luxury sedan gliding into her reserved spot. She stepped out, briefcase in hand, her confidence faltering as she faced the military assembly. Her face paled, heels clicking uncertainly as she approached. He doesn't work here anymore," she stammered, clutching her portfolio. A lieutenant, ribbons across his chest, met her gaze. "We know," he said firmly, "but honor isn't on a payroll, it's ingratitude." The unit marched onto the grounds, their steps commanding respect. Parents abandoned routines, parking haphazardly to follow. Students pressed against classroom windows, breath fogging the glass. Teachers clustered in doorways, whispering questions. In the courtyard, the Marines raised an American flag, its fabric snapping against the Florida sky. The sight was breathtaking, a symbol of something larger than words. Captain Becker stepped forward, microphone in hand, his voice booming through the school's PA system. "Students of Jefferson Elementary, I'm Captain Ronald Becker, United States Marine Corps. 3 days ago, a man who served with distinction was removed from this school for an act of kindness. That man, Walter Harris, didn't just feed a hungry child. He fed my nephew, the son of a fallen Marine." Gasps spread, parents and teachers exchanging stunned glances. Becker's voice wavered with emotion, his words a tribute to Walter, to Jaden, to a legacy that would not be forgotten. The air was thick with tension as Principal Landers stood frozen, her hand pressed against her throat, the weight of her decision crashing over her like a tidal wave. She had enforced the rules with precision, as she always did, but now, standing before Captain Becker and his Marines, she felt the ground shift beneath her. Her carefully curated world of policies and procedures was unraveling, and the realization of what she had done, firing Walter Harris, clawed at her conscience. Her heart raced, not with fear, but with the dawning awareness of the man she had so casually dismissed. Captain Becker's voice cut through the murmurs of the growing crowd, steady but laced with a quiet intensity that demanded attention. His words carried the weight of grief and pride, each syllable trembling with the depth of his loss. "Mr. Harris never told you who he was," he said, his eyes locking onto Landers with an unflinching gaze. "He never spoke of his time in Iraq, where he bore the solemn duty of ensuring fallen soldiers returned home with the dignity they deserved. He never mentioned that he personally prepared my brother's uniform for his funeral, ensuring every detail was perfect. He never boasted that he stayed by my brother's side for 2 days and nights, keeping vigil so he was never alone on his final journey home." Becker's voice cracked just for a moment, betraying the raw pain he still carried for his brother, Staff Sergeant Michael Becker. The crowd around them swelled as parents arrived, summoned by urgent calls and texts about the unexpected military presence at Jefferson Elementary. News vans lined the curb, their reporters sensing a story that transcended the ordinary Monday morning. Cameras clicked, capturing the scene as Becker continued, his words painting a vivid picture of sacrifice and honor. "The child Mr. Harris helped," he said, his voice steadying, "is the son of my brother Michael, who gave his life shielding a civilian convoy from enemy fire. 3 children owe their lives to him. He was awarded the Silver Star for his courage." And Walter Harris, without knowing any of this, carried forward Michael's legacy by ensuring his son didn't go hungry. Behind Becker, the Marines stood in perfect formation, their faces stoic, eyes fixed forward, embodying the discipline and reverence that defined their service. Each one was a testament to the unspoken bond they shared, not just with each other, but with men like Walter, who had served quietly and selflessly. The weight of their presence pressed against Landers, who stood rigid, her usual poise shattered under the collective gaze of parents, staff, and soldiers. She felt exposed, her authority stripped away by the truth she hadn't known. Her mind scrambled for a response, but the practiced phrases she relied on as an administrator failed her. We didn't know," she stammered, her voice barely audible. "The policy on outside food is clear." A gunnery sergeant stepped forward, his presence commanding yet calm. "With all due respect, ma'am," he said, his voice firm but not unkind, "sometimes humanity outranks policy." The Marines behind him nodded in silent agreement, their unity a quiet rebuke to the rigidity of rules that had led to Walter's dismissal. Landers felt the sting of those words, her face flushing as she realized the depth of her misstep. She had followed protocol, but in doing so, she had overlooked the human cost. Later that day, the Marines drove to Walter's modest apartment complex, their convoy drawing curious glances from neighbors who peered out from windows and balconies. The sight of uniformed soldiers parking along the quiet street was a spectacle, one that stirred whispers and speculation. When Walter opened his door, dressed in simple khakis and a faded button-up shirt, he froze, his breath catching at the sight of the Marine standing at attention, saluting him. His weathered face, etched with years of quiet service, registered confusion and humility. "What is all this?" he asked, his voice soft, almost lost in the moment. "Mr. Harris," the lieutenant said, stepping forward, "you may not realize the impact of your actions, but to us, you embody the silent honor that acts without seeking recognition or reward." The words struck Walter deeply, stirring memories of his time in service, moments he had never spoken of, burdens he had carried alone. The Marines presented him with a letter of appreciation from the Department of Defense, signed by the Secretary himself, along with a Community Honor Medal, specially crafted for those whose service extended beyond the uniform. They offered him a new role as an ethics instructor for the local youth military program, complete with full benefits and a housing allowance. Walter stood there, his hands trembling slightly as he held the letter, overwhelmed by the recognition he had never sought. What unfolded next was unexpected, a moment that rippled beyond the small apartment complex. News crews arrived, their cameras capturing the extraordinary sight of dozens of Marines escorting Walter back to Jefferson Elementary. The convoy grew as they drove, joined by veterans from the community who had heard of Walter's story. American flags fluttered from car windows, a spontaneous tribute to a man who had acted with quiet heroism. At the school, students lined the walkway, clutching handmade signs that read, "Thank you, Mr. Walter," and "Heroes feed heroes." Teachers stood behind them, some dabbing at tears, moved by the significance of the moment. The morning's impromptu assembly had transformed into a profound lesson in honor, one that no textbook could ever convey. Principal Landers stood at the school's entrance, her tailored suit and impeccable hair a stark contrast to Walter's unassuming dignity and the Marines' formal uniforms. Her discomfort was palpable, a mix of shame and uncertainty swirling within her as Captain Becker approached with Walter at his side. She braced herself, expecting judgment, but Walter's voice was gentle, steady. "Mrs. Landers," he said, extending his hand, "I understand why you enforce the rules. Schools need order, but sometimes rules need exceptions." His words were not an accusation, but an olive branch, a reflection of the compassion that had driven him to act in the first place. Instead of responding, Landers handed him an envelope containing his reinstatement papers and a formal apology from the school board, who had convened an emergency meeting after receiving dozens of calls from Marine headquarters. The gesture was meant to mend the fracture her decision had caused, but Walter didn't immediately accept. He looked at her, his eyes steady and resolute. "Before I consider coming back," he said, "I'd like the school to implement a no-questions-asked food program. No child should ever have to explain why they're hungry." His words hung in the air, a quiet challenge born not of anger but of conviction, a call to ensure that compassion would always find a way. Captain Becker strode to the podium, his Marine Corps uniform crisp, his gaze steady with purpose. "The Marine Corps will fully fund this initiative," he declared, his voice resonant with conviction. "We'll name it the Becker-Harris Program, honoring my brother's legacy and the man who stood by his son when no one else did." The announcement sent a murmur through the crowd, cameras flashing like a sudden storm, capturing the moment for posterity. Among the throng of reporters and onlookers, Walter, the unassuming janitor, stood quietly, his weathered hands clasped in front of him. His eyes, however, caught a flicker of movement, a small figure half hidden behind a woman who had taken a rare day off work after a cryptic call about this gathering. It was Jaden, the boy whose quiet courage had set all this in motion. In a heartbeat, Jaden broke free from his mother's gentle hold, his sneakers pounding the ground as he ran toward Walter. The boy's arms wrapped tightly around the old janitor, his embrace fierce with gratitude and awe. Walter knelt, his knees creaking, to meet Jaden's tear-streaked face. "You never told me your dad was a hero," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, a mix of pride and sorrow for the boy who had lost so much, yet given even more. Jaden's eyes shimmered, his voice trembling as he replied, "And you never told me you were one too." In that moment, the world seemed to pause, the noise of the crowd fading into a distant hum. For Walter, the weight of years spent unnoticed, sweeping floors and quietly helping where he could, lifted slightly. For Jaden, the pain of his father's absence and the hunger he'd once hidden was softened by the knowledge that someone had seen him, truly seen him. The ceremony continued, but Walter's mind lingered on the boy's words. He'd never thought of himself as a hero. He was just a man who couldn't ignore a child's empty lunchbox, who left food on a stone bench because it was the right thing to do. Yet here he was, surrounded by gratitude he'd never sought. As the reporters clamored for quotes, Walter slipped to the sidelines, declining interviews with a polite shake of his head. He didn't need their words or their money. The only keepsakes he accepted were a framed flag and a badge inscribed with a simple truth: the unit never forgets those who stood right when others turned away. Those words burned in his chest, a quiet validation of a life lived in service, even if that service had been invisible to most. Jaden, meanwhile, returned to Jefferson Elementary with a new lunchbox, courtesy of his uncle's Marine unit. But it wasn't the lunchbox that drew attention. It was the boy himself. Every day, without fail, he shared half his meal with someone else. His teachers, initially puzzled, asked why he did it. Jaden's answer was as straightforward as it was profound. Because that's what heroes do. The words carried a weight that silenced the room. This was no longer just the son of a fallen Marine or the nephew of a captain. Jaden had become a symbol of something greater, a child who, through a single letter penned in defense of a janitor, had shifted the culture of his school and mobilized an entire military branch. His act of defiance, born from a heart that refused to let injustice slide, had rippled far beyond the playground. In the schoolyard, the stone bench where Walter once left food for Jaden now held a small plaque. Its inscription read, "Here, someone once did right, not because he was told to, but because he couldn't look away." The words were a quiet testament to a moment when compassion had triumphed over indifference. For the students who passed by, it was a reminder that even the smallest acts could carry monumental weight. For Walter, it was a humbling acknowledgement of a choice he'd made without expecting reward. 6 months later, the Becker-Harris program had taken root in 47 schools across the state. Its mission was elegantly simple: provide food to any child, no questions asked. Funded by veterans organizations and staffed by volunteers, many of them former service members, the program became a lifeline for kids who knew hunger's sting. For the veterans, it was more than charity. It was a renewed sense of purpose, a way to serve beyond the battlefield. They saw themselves in the children they helped, remembering their own struggles or the comrades they'd lost. Each meal served was a small act of defiance against a world that too often overlooked the vulnerable. Walter, true to form, remained at Jefferson Elementary during the week, his mop and broom as much a part of him as his quiet resolve. He'd accepted a weekend teaching role with a youth military program, but only after much coaxing. The classroom gave him a chance to share lessons he'd learned not from books, but from life. Lessons about courage, compassion, and the power of doing right even when no one was watching. His presence at the school, however, was more than a job. It was a living reminder that kindness sometimes demanded bravery, that standing up for someone could mean standing alone first. Principal Landers, forever altered by the events, became Walter's unexpected ally. Once a figure of rigid authority, she now saw rules as tools to serve people, not chains to bind them. Her office door, once a formidable barrier, now stood open, a sign above it declaring, "Solutions start here." The change in her was palpable, born from the humbling realization that a janitor and a child had shown her what leadership truly meant. Together, she and Walter reshaped the school's policies, creating a culture where empathy trumped bureaucracy. One afternoon, as Walter walked the hallways, he noticed a first grader slipping a sandwich to a classmate. The child froze, eyes wide with fear of reprimand. Walter's heart softened. Kneeling down, he smiled and whispered, "Sometimes kindness is the most important rule." The children's faces lit up, their nervous giggles echoing as they continued their quiet exchange. For Walter, it was a moment of quiet triumph, proof that the seeds he'd planted were taking root. The story of Jefferson Elementary spread far beyond the state, igniting national conversations about supporting military families and the power of small acts. Legislators in 3 states drafted bills for hunger-free campuses, citing the Becker-Harris program as inspiration. Captain Becker became a frequent visitor, bringing Marines to speak with students about service, not just in combat, but in community, in loyalty to one another. During one visit, he pulled Walter aside, his voice low with emotion. "My brother would be proud," he said, his eyes glistening, "not just for what you did for Jaden, but for what you've started." Walter, ever humble, patted the captain's shoulder. "We just reminded folks that every uniform, every child, carries a story we might not know." On Veterans Day, Jefferson Elementary hosted a ceremony that brought the community together. Students and Marines stood shoulder to shoulder as Walter raised the flag, his hands steady despite the weight of the moment. Jaden stood beside him, no longer the hungry boy who hid his shame, but a young man learning the strength of standing up for others. As the flag reached its peak, Walter saluted, not just as a former soldier, but as a man who'd found a new mission, ensuring no child felt forgotten. No act of kindness went unnoticed. The ripples of that simple lunch bag continued to spread, a testament to the quiet power of those who refuse to look away when someone needs help.